Dears, thank you for joining us for another NSSG Talks edition, the webinar series through which we discuss global risks impacting on our businesses that operate at the international level. With this episode, we will be focusing on Kazakhstan and what are the business opportunities as well as the risks that are impacting this particular country, and why it became so important into the recent uh, business environment, international environment, and how this connects to the geopolitical updates of this period. But before jumping into our topic of discussion, I would like to have a small introduction about NSSG. NSSG is a risk management company. We are based in Romania, Bucharest, from where we operate 24/7 our operations and projects at the global level. We managed to open also some international offices, one based in Cairo, one in Kiev, and one in New York. Of course, more details and more about our team and capabilities at global level can be found on our website nssg.global. And without further delaying on marketing, on the marketing portion and topics, I would like to introduce our guest speakers of this edition. Namely, we have together with us today Robert Balante, Senior Eurasia Intelligence Analyst, who will be, of course, discussing about the political and geopolitical environment that is impacting Kazakhstan nowadays. And of course, last but not least, we have with us Joe Frederick, senior consultant between NSSG. And when I think about Joe, I like to describe him as the person that can very well connect geopolitical events to business implications. So, of course, Joe will be having the role of trying to connect the geopolitical environment to the business implications and how Kazakhstan can be a very good opportunity to invest, but of course, if we take the appropriate risk management measures. So as said briefly, if we look at the agenda of today, the NSSG intro and welcoming has been, let's say, accomplished by my brief message right now, and we will dive into looking at Kazakhstan and why Kazakhstan became suddenly so important in the business arena at global level. And this portion will be covered by my colleague Joe, while the geopolitical and political updates, as well as a brief analysis over the elections, recent elections results in Kazakhstan, will be given by our colleague Robert Balante. Not before mentioning, I will pass the microphone to my colleagues, but not before mentioning that we do wait for questions and answers at the end of our discussion. And another, let's say, technical note is the fact that this webinar is being recorded, so please be aware about this when you answer or if you would like to take the microphone at the end of our webinar. Be mindful that we are recording this webinar, so please just keep your camera shut, or just announce us if you would like to pose a question in an anonymous way. No more details from my side, so I will pass the microphone to my much smarter colleagues that will dig in our topic of focus of this webinar. Thank you.
to support our kind of geopolitical risk efforts and endeavors. But right now, I'd like to introduce kind of Robert Balante, who will be the real star of this this webinar, and we're going to exploit his expertise to no end. Robert, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction. I am Robert Balante, Senior Eurasia Analyst, so I focus on Eurasia, as you can imagine, the post-Soviet space, and I have a particular interest in Kazakhstan, and hopefully today you will learn some interesting facts or have some insights on how to improve your risk mitigation strategies.
Cool.
All right, so I think we can get going into our discussion right now. Thank you both for the brief introduction that you have done. So I will switch the conversation to you, Joe. So we would like to understand more about Kazakhstan and why it became so important recently for the global business environment. If you can share a bit of your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been a lot of like interest in Kazakhstan, I should say, you know, since independence. You know, particularly in kind of the extractive sector, mainly in the western part of that region. But you know, Kazakhstan itself, as you can see, is, you know, it's kind of the ninth largest country in the world. You know, was a border kind of China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Russia, and I think to Turkmenistan as well. Which, you know, from a kind of business and trade perspective, you know, can provide market access, direct market access, I should say, to billions of consumers, right? So, you know, it's rich in the extractives, oil and gas, and minerals in particular. But at the same time, you know, what Kazakhstan's trying to do, or has been doing quite successfully, I would say, is diversifying its economy, right? So from manufacturing to pharmaceuticals to now the kind of green energy sector, and now tourism as well. There's a lot to kind of look into in terms of economic interest and business interest in Kazakhstan. And the government itself has kind of really implemented a lot of business-friendly incentives as well for multinationals to set up business there. Now, I think there's a lot of kind of challenges of operating in Kazakhstan. You know, one is the domestic political situation, which I think Robert will kind of, you know, provide a lot of valuable insight into. But more recently, it's to do with the geopolitics, right, of the region, and namely to do with what's happening in Ukraine, right? So ever since the onset of the conflict, you know, last year, you know, it's put kind of Kazakhstan and a lot of the other these kind of post-Soviet states in a difficult position, right? So, you know, where do their alliances lie, basically, you know? And so I know Putin has made concerted efforts to really, you know, kind of ensure that he's got support, you know, from a kind of political perspective and security perspective from these Central Asian states. And I think, you know, from the Central Asian states perspective, in particular Kazakhstan, because it's seen as a kind of leader in this region, is that, you know, Kazakhstan, and I know Robert will kind of agree with me on this, that it has a very complex relationship with Moscow, and it always has. But now it's at this position where, you know, it sees an opportunity, right? So how do we become more prominent in the world, you know, from a kind of political perspective, geopolitical perspective, security perspective, and also kind of economic perspective as well? And so you will have seen quite recently that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a visit back in February to kind of, and Robert will probably kind of expand on this as well, as more of a kind of symbolic gesture. I'm sure there was about $50 million, you know, that ended up, that will end up in Kazakhstan's kind of banks, you know, after that visit, basically, mainly to kind of boost economic ties. But it was a largely kind of symbolic gesture as well, to say that, hey, you know, the U.S. is here to kind of support you, your sovereign territorial integrity in particular, you know, and we're going to support you kind of politically as well. And the other thing that the U.S. government has done is kind of issued kind of sanctions waivers, right? So any businesses that are still tied up in Russia, the U.S. government has given them kind of grace period to kind of scale down those operations, basically. And that's a kind of good thing for businesses, right? And so, because one of the kind of business risk, a huge business risk since the war started was the sanctions, from the EU, from the US, from all these kind of opposition states, I should say, on Russia. That's really kind of taking a real kind of stranglehold on the economy at the moment. So, there's a lot of opportunities in Kazakhstan, but there's also a lot of risk, right? From geopolitics to security to, routine business risks as well. And so, I think I'll end right there. And I think we should give more time to kind of Robert to kind of really give a lot of insight into on these three aspects, right? So geopolitics, economics, and kind of domestic politics, because they had recent elections, right? And those elections are kind of tied into reform package by the Tokayev government, wasn't it? So, but I'll end right here and I'll introduce Robert Balante, who's going to really provide some valuable insight into the state.
So thank you very much, Joe. Indeed, I will start from an overview of the domestic political situation, and then we will move on to a more geopolitical and security implications point of view. So as you have said, on Monday this week, so on the 27th of March, the Central Electoral Commission of Kazakhstan has finally certified the results of the elections that had happened a week previously for the Majlis, which is the lower house of parliament. Candidates from 6 parties and 7 ostensibly independent ones will now represent the Kazakh citizens. However, most likely there will be no real opposition to President Tokayev, who has ruled the country since 2019, following close to 3 decades of Nazarbayev rule, who was the communist leader of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan and then became president. So as a result of the current elections, approximately 2/3, just below actually, of the deputies are members of the Amanat ruling party. And this result, let me say, is a little bit surprising. Some Western observers might say even a bit disappointing, considering that an ad hoc electoral reform was implemented in the run-up to these elections. In fact, overall, there are 98 seats in the lower house of parliament. 69 deputies were elected according to a proportional system from party lists, while 29 seats were assigned through a majoritarian first-past-the-post system, for which independent candidates with no formal party affiliation were allowed to run for the first time in 2 decades. However, old Nazarbayev-era practices aimed at doctoring election results, such as ballot stuffing or behind closed-door manipulations, were indeed registered on multiple occasions by independent observers during the elections. So this is exactly where the disappointment came from, because Tokayev had laid out the vision of a so-called new Kazakhstan, but at the end of the day, this had little in common with on-the-ground realities. I'm sure most of you remember that in January of last year, the so-called Bloody January events took place, which saw tens of thousands of people protesting and almost 300 dead. Tokayev actually did acknowledge in the follow-up that social triggers had led to these protests, and he promised liberalizing reforms. However, they did not really materialize. In fact, right after this protest, Tokayev has focused on removing Nazarbayev associates from the levers of political and economic power, and this move was very much welcomed by the local population. But their replacements, at the end of the day, came from the same elite group. Maybe they were not the closest associates of Nazarbayev, but their social circles were pretty much the same. And this is mostly due to a lack of cadres in the country. Additionally, mere weeks after the protests took place, Russia's war in Ukraine started, and it sent shockwaves across the post-Soviet space. And people in Kazakhstan were mostly looking for stability rather change when compared to what was happening in Ukraine. So now Tokayev has consolidated power in his own hands, and going forward, his promised reform agenda looks a little bit uncertain. In fact, there are two options basically. Going ahead, he might decide to implement these reforms or preserve the existing system, which now sees him at the center rather than Nazarbayev. So let's look at a more benign way forward, and that, for example, as a possible scenario, Tokayev might devolve some power to business-friendly bodies, which are not directly elected by citizens, with the goal of improving their international reputation and domestic regulation to foster economic development. For example, a review of the taxation systems could take place, or also goods tracing to improve international accountability, and we will look into this later on. From the point of view of international companies active in Kazakhstan, though, a reform agenda, while might lead to greater market access, it might also lead to a reshuffle in the domestic bureaucracy. Therefore, those that have been active in the country for a while might not see the people they're used to taking decisions. And from a point of view of lobbying, for example, additional investments and research will be required into the country. So now, looking at a geopolitical perspective and going beyond the domestic aspects, it has to be said that throughout the war in Ukraine, Tokayev managed to maintain a good balance between the two sides. On one hand, he didn't offer open support for the war, and he insists on the recognition on Ukraine's 1991 borders, which means no Crimea and, of course, no recent annexations carried out by Russia. But on the other, he maintained deep trade relations with Russia, and actually 2022 saw a 25% year-on-year growth in exports towards the Russian market. So let me just give you an example. In 2021, Kazakhstan exported $12,000 worth of semiconductors to Russia. The following year, in 2022, it was almost $4 million. And actually, I believe this talk that we're having right now is very timely because there is a potential for this balance that Tokayev managed to strike to be compromised in just 2 days. Because on the 1st of April, Kazakhstan has announced the beginning of operations for a new tracking tool, which will allow to monitor all goods entering and exiting the country. And this is in response to an EU move, which has started looking into sanctions evasion schemes, and specifically focusing on those countries that are facilitating re-exports to Russia of dual-use goods. The EU is worried that consumer goods, for example, video cameras, even used cars or washing machines, could be disassembled inside Russia and its components used for military needs, such as chips for missiles and drones. However, it has to be said that both Russia and Kazakhstan are part of the Eurasian Economic Union, a common trading bloc, which means that there are no custom checks between the two countries. And this new system that Kazakhstan plans to launch in just 2 days, it's a little bit uncertain actually how it will work and what effect it will have. Overall, however, it has to be said that Kazakhstan has a very well diversified foreign policy, and it follows a so-called multi-vector approach. So let's look, for example, at international trade. China, Russia, and the EU all account for more than 10% of the national exports. And as Joe was mentioning, the US in this case is not actually a very prominent player, with somewhere in between 1 and 2% of exports going to the US. However, here it's important to underline that Russia has a somewhat outsized role in the Kazakh economy, because if you look at the map, we see the Caspian pipeline, which from northern Caspian Sea goes through part of the Kazakh territory and then goes into Russia. And 80% of Kazakh oil exports go through this pipeline. And oil and petroleum products account for approximately 50% of the overall national budget. And this clearly gives Moscow very, very strong leverage. So in the context of EU pressure on Kazakhstan to curb its re-exports to Russia, Brussels should likely, in my view at least, Brussels should be very careful. In fact, ultimately, were EU pressure to become excessive on Kazakhstan and it would have to choose sides, it would likely opt for Russia and China. So now, this brings us to China. In fact, Kazakhstan occupies a very privileged place in the Chinese coordinate of priorities. For example, Xi Jinping, when he originally announced the Belt and Road Initiative, he did it in Kazakhstan. Then, following COVID, the first trip that the Chinese leader carried out was also to Kazakhstan to meet with Tokayev. And interestingly, during this trip, Xi pledged support for Kazakh's independence and its territorial integrity. And when it happened, most observers read it as a direct message to Moscow. We will protect Kazakh's independence and territorial integrity. China and Kazakhstan are expanding bilateral trade. They're building new railway connections across the 1,800 kilometers long border. So cooperation is very, very important. And lastly, before turning to Joe for the conclusion and then Q&A, I would like to mention the fact that when Xi traveled to Moscow last week, in the joint statement, there was a section which focused on Central Asia. Basically, the two sides pledged to strengthen their cooperation in this geographical area, support the sovereignty of all states, and oppose the promotion of color revolutions. Color revolutions in the Russian narrative are those protests which, according to Moscow, are sponsored by Western actors, and they intend to overthrow pro-Russian governments in the post-Soviet space. Ultimately, I have to underline the fact that, in my view, the two countries have a lot more to gain from cooperation in the region rather than open confrontation. And therefore, going forward, they're likely to accommodate their respective differences and continue cooperating in the area, at least in the midterm, rather than confronting each other. And with this, over to you, Joe.
That was brilliant, Robert, as always. As you were kind of talking there, I had like a long list. I wrote like a long list of questions, which I'm hoping that we'll be able to tackle some of them, not all of them, at least in this forum. But I think, would it be correct in saying that the optimal word to use when it comes to Kazakhstan or phrase is achieving balance, right? Achieving balance between its relationships with Russia, China, achieving balance in domestically between the citizenry and the elites, right? Who have like kind of a vast kind of economic interest, basically. So would you agree with me, like balance is the kind of optimal word for Kazakhstan government at this stage?
Yes, for sure. So if we start from the international perspective, as I mentioned very briefly, actually ever since independence, Kazakhstan has been pursuing this multi-vector foreign policy. Russia remains the privileged partner to this day because beyond trade, there is, of course, the security component, and Russia supplies most of the weapon systems to Kazakhstan. But at the same time, in the early days of independence, Nazarbayev reached out to many Western states. If I'm not mistaken, he even holds various British medals of honor for fostering cooperation between Kazakhstan and the UK. At the same time, now with the rise of China, of course, it has become an increasingly important partner. But I have to say that the Western role at the moment is not as prominent as it used to be in the past. Because basically Western and US in particular presence in Kazakhstan was instrumental to the effort in Afghanistan, which at the moment is not happening anymore, as we are all aware, and therefore the West has slightly pulled back. But Blinken's visit that you mentioned at the beginning wants to send a message diplomatically. We're still here, we're looking, but de facto beyond this diplomatic support, not much at the moment is happening, but this might very well change in the future. Looking at it from a domestic point of view, what Tokayev has to balance now is this demand for change, but also demand for stability against the background of what is happening in Ukraine. While for the past year and 3 months following the January events, he has rather focused on stability, even though he kept promising reforms and change. Looking ahead, the benign view is that this change will take place. He will try to liberalize the economy and possibly open up the political system, even though most people were hoping for him to open up the political system for these elections. Some signs have happened. New parties have been allowed to register, but at the end, no truly independent candidates made it to into the lower house of parliament. Therefore, I'm not entirely sure actually this political liberalization will happen in the near term, but gradually it might start to happen.
Okay. I mean, let's kind of stay on that strand there, basically, and there's a kind of another question I wanna ask. In terms of the kind of domestic political reforms, basically, you know, my take on it is that they lack substance, right? So, talking to people, kind of doing the research into it, is that the people on the ground, overall think that change isn't going to happen overnight or next year or over the next couple of years, basically. And so and what these kind of reforms do for the Tokayev presidency and the government is that it kind of gives him a bit more credibility for when he came into power. He promised these reforms, he's kind of put in some reforms, but it's also kind of lining him up for the 2024 elections, and that gives him kind of, I guess, further weight and credibility that he can say, see, I promised you reforms, I've given you these reforms, therefore I'm going to run again as a kind of credible candidate for the elections, basically. Now tie this into like the business aspect. If you've got these kind of business elites, and you got kind of these multinational interests, I guess my question is like, will these business elites, see that political reform is good for the country and therefore business? So, how long will it take to kind of change their perspective and mind, basically? And I guess that's my question. There seems to be this kind of, you can't have this kind of like ruling elite authoritarianism with the kind of cursory level reforms to go much further, right? Because the backlash is another repeat of what happened in January 2022, right? So what do you think is the mindset of these kind of Kazakh business elites, in terms of domestic politics?
Yeah, so in my view, one of the problems that the business elite and the political elite has in Kazakhstan is that it's basically not very numerous. It's just the same old faces. And that's why Tokayev cannot push too hard in terms of political reform. He doesn't have enough people. Kazakhstan is sponsoring a lot of study abroad programs, but these people that are coming back are still very young. They're not ready to be placed in positions of power. And it's really hard to understand whether there is a genuine demand for reform coming from the elites. From the people, there is, and it's been visible in between now, the January events and now. For the first time, some public demonstrations of dissent have been allowed. As I said, new parties have been registered. So yes, there has been some liberalization, but it's been very, very limited and not up to the Western expectations, let me say. But also, and this might be a bit of an pro-authoritarian argument, if I can say it this way, Kazakhstan has never had a Western-style democracy, and the transition necessarily has to be slow. In fact, these January events are being used by some as an example of what democracy leads to. You know, you're allowing people to protest, and you end up with 300 people dead. So the likelihood of a quick transition is very, very low. The demand for rapid reform from the elites, it's also not very strong because they're afraid of losing what over time they have managed to secure. But the most progressive citizens in the large cities are demanding, are asking for it, but also it's not very active. In fact, if we look at the turnout for these elections in the largest city, Almaty, it has been only 25%. So that's very, very low.
Okay, one more question, Robert, and we're going to take a kind of zoom out about 30,000 feet, basically, and we're going to tie in the geopolitics and the security and economics. And Lily, if you go back to that map, can you hear me, Lily? Oh yeah, there you go. Cool. So you'll see at the almost very center of this map is the Baikonur space complex. And so quite recently, I think maybe 2-3 weeks ago, the Kazakh government kind of seized some Russian property, is that correct? And kind of forbid the transport of this kind of space equipment to and from Russia, basically, or from Kazakhstan, etc. So, you know, I mean, that's obviously kind of has annoyed Moscow, right? So, you know, what's the kind of potential backlash, you know, and what does this say about industries that want to maybe get into the space sector in Kazakhstan, right? So, yeah, if you can kind of give us your insights on that.
Yes, this is actually a very, very good observation. So Baikonur has been the favorite place to launch Russian missiles into space ever since Soviet times. But then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a special deal struck between the two countries. And these latest developments, it's actually, they fit into a broader trend of a renegotiation in between Russia and Kazakhstan. While in some realms Russia is being curtailed, the Russian interests are being pressured. In other realms, they're being allowed to grow. For example, Putin has put forward the idea of a trilateral cartel, basically, for the production and export of gas in between Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And very recently, last week, the head of Gazprom, Mr. Miller, has met with Tokayev, the president. But going back to the space industry, Kazakhstan has good infrastructure for space launches. Western company potentially could be allowed to use some of this infrastructure, but again, this is unlikely to happen in the short term. And while Russia does have other cosmodromes, other facilities to launch its rockets into space from Russian territory, this one, Baikonur, is much better placed geographically to conduct these launches. And were, let's say, other Western companies to be allowed in parallel to access this territory, this would necessarily have to have the green light from Moscow, and at the moment this doesn't seem likely, unless, for example, there are some technology transfers in between Moscow and the US, and not the US, but the private Western companies that are active in space. But considering the context of the Ukraine war, I don't see this happening soon.
Yeah, I know the that property or parts of that property in Baikonur is leased by the Russian government. So, do you know what the kind of, I guess, terms are in terms of like when it ends, or is?
I know it's 50-year leases, but I'm not entirely sure when is the date when it ends. But it's very long-term leases, and if I'm not mistaken, if it's 50 years, collapse of the Soviet Union happened around 30 years ago, so we at least have 20 more years to go. But please don't take it for a fact.
No, we'll look that up. So, but I understand that they're also kind of expanding that complex as well, right? So, developing the infrastructure, but also kind of expanding it, which means that they want to attract more interests in that particular complex, basically.
Correct.
As you mentioned, they've got really good infrastructure, and it's a kind of really good place for well, space launches, right? Because you're closer to the equator and etc. So. Yeah, cool. I don't have any other questions at this moment. So should we hand back to Lily? Because
guys, thank you so much for you jumped and took my role. Just pouring a lot of questions, which was my trick to do. But let me rebalance this, and I will ask you a question, Joe. So switching back to the conclusions, Joe, please share with us this perspective from your point of view, having heard all of these details and this complex context that Kazakhstan is sitting right now in. What would you think from a business perspective that we should be very attentive when thinking about investing or thinking about relocating our operations to Kazakhstan? What an organization should be careful about, let's say?
Yeah, I think from a business perspective, in terms of like kind of taxes and legislations, I think the Kazakhstan government has kind of proven itself to be very friendly towards attracting more FDI, basically. And so, so I don't think there's any particular kind of issues there, with the exception of kind of, I guess, bureaucracy, right? And so, you're talking about a kind of a post-Soviet government that is still kind of highly bureaucratic, I would say. And Robert can probably provide more insight as well. So, and kind of tied into that implicitly is also kind of I guess kind of predatory behaviors, possibly kind of corruption and fraud as well. And so I know that although these incentives are being presented for foreign businesses to operate there, they still have to be wary of things like corruption and bribery, basically, particularly when dealing with public officials. So, and that's an issue that's quite endemic. It's tied to politics as well. So it's not going to end overnight. So I think substantive reforms in terms of making government processes more transparent is something to be on the lookout for, basically. And so I don't know if there's any kind of explicit reform packages in place to make corruption less endemic, I'd say, because you can't completely get rid of it. It is in the kind of Tokayev kind of plank or not, but Robert could probably kind of confirm that. Also, I guess the big thing really is more to do with kind of geopolitics, really. And so, namely, everything kind of ties back into the Ukraine war, right? And so, and sanctions, there are, according to the Kazakh government back in October of last year, they made claims that roughly, 800 to 1,000 Russian-based businesses were moving to Kazakhstan, a month, or were expressing intentions to move to Kazakhstan a month, basically. And with tied to this is obviously the kind of sanctions risk, by the EU, by the US, and again tied to what's happening in Ukraine. And so there's a lot of opportunities for sanctions evasion, right? And so Robert talked about this kind of tracking mechanism, right? So repurposed goods and whatnot, and that's an issue that foreign businesses need to be aware of as well. So, but I think from a kind of, I guess, business perspective, again, there's a lot of incentives there to start a business or expand your presence. But also kind of domestically, you've got to deal with politics and lack of reforms, basically, for social reforms, political reforms, corruption as well. And geopolitically, you got to look at kind of sanctions risk and compliance burdens and whatnot. So a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of challenges as well.
Thank you for this. So I get from your perspective that we should still consider Kazakhstan as a business opportunity, but do well your due diligence and third-party vendor checks from what I hear, because they might be somehow connected with the sanctioned company. Guess that. So yeah, definitely this is something that we should be aware of. Kazakhstan is not attractive only for the Western companies that went out of Russia post sanctions, but also for Russian companies that are looking to still get connected to the global commercial environment. Thank you for these notes. And of course, I will not spare Robert from a question because you jumped on him with so many before. But please, Robert, if you can. So from this perspective, it's clear the state looks for balance. Okay, they're not keen to take any side, and they would like to take advantage from this moment as much as possible. And if they can be allowed to deal with both, that will be fantastic. What about the people? How the people feel about this? Do you have any inputs from the population side? Because if we look back in January, the main reason why people went to streets was the gas prices. Now, with Gazprom being friendly with Kazakhstan, that's let's say checked. So what about other feelings from the population? Could be the economic one, how to say, winning in front of the social perspective and cultural perspective?
Yeah, so in terms of the main concerns of the population, I would say honestly it's not political, it's economical, because still Kazakhstan is a developing country, ingrained in the scheme of materialist and post-materialist values. The materialist values still prevail, so people have a tendency to prioritize, understandably, feeding their family rather than having a free press. But with time, this is likely to change. However, most people thought the same about China, and it's not really clear whether there is a demand for this democratization change inside China. But coming back to Kazakhstan, so I believe economic priorities still remain number one. In terms of the people's view of the war, there is no clear sociology, but the country is likely polarized. In fact, the most progressive people that live in the cities are likely to oppose the war. In fact, there are various examples of Kazakhstan setting up humanitarian help in Ukraine, in Bucha specifically. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who are addicted, let me say, to Russian television, which is very much present in Kazakhstan, and they tend to support Russia. But at the end of the day, both views have been allowed to express. Both views have been expressed publicly in Kazakhstan, and there have been no preferences, at least publicly by the authorities. Tokayev actually has said, sitting next to Putin, that Kazakhstan would not recognize the annexations of the new territories, but people who support the Russian point of view have not been persecuted either in the country. So economic priorities, polarization in regards to the war. this would be my two points.
Thank you so much for this comment. And yeah, definitely. So we agree to disagree until economics put a pressure on our shoulders. That's the situation that I get from the population side. So if we have anybody with us here that would like to pose a question to these wonderful gentlemen speakers of our today's talks, please raise hands. Yes, actually you have to raise hands for me to allow you, and with a microphone. If not, of course, I can go on with questions forever, but they will not come to our talks anymore. So I guess they're not much people are not willing to put questions. Okay, no problem. I think that we were very clear on what are the perks, let's say, and the risks of making business in Kazakhstan. Thank you both for joining our talks today, and of course for the public, do note that this is a recorded session, and we will be sharing the recording with you all. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any last comments, please let me know. Joe, Robert, if you...
No, I mean, I've got so many questions here that I imagine I'll just talk to Robert tomorrow and ask him. So, but yeah, no, this has been good. Thank you.
Super. Thank you guys for this wonderful discussion and for the ideas that we shared. And yeah, let's keep on sharing knowledge from the NSSG Talks webinar series. We are committed on, to hold this series, but I don't know for how long, hopefully for forever, because we do see that there are important topics that we discuss here, and hopefully they will be also very helpful for the organizations that are represented in our attendance. Thank you both again, and have a wonderful day again.
Thank you. Bye.